You ever go outside?
This sucks.
If you're anything like me, insane, you need a constant source of dopamine frying your brain at all times. And me, I need non-stop entertainment. Well, it's either that or drugs. Pick your poison. Well, say you're outside. No drugs in sight. What do? Well, you could always bring something like your NES outside and find your nearest TV.
Something tells me I am not gonna find a TV out here.
Well, that's where the Game Boy comes into play. You don't need a TV for this thing. There's a screen already on it. Do you guys think the invention of the Game Boy was the start of the spiraling attention spans that we have now? You see, now Mario isn't just an at-home thing. I can play him anywhere I go, whether that be a good or a bad thing. The car? Yeah. The bathroom? Maybe a little unsanitary. At school instead of my schoolwork? Hey, wait a second. The Nintendo Game Boy was the first console in the lineage of handheld Nintendo consoles. While being the first technical console, it's not Nintendo's first handheld system. For a while, Nintendo ran the handheld market with the Game & Watch, and these things were so charming. It's hard to say if Game & Watches are actual video games since there's no technical video on the screen. It's the equivalent of a souped-up calculator. They could only really display images burned onto the screen itself, meaning all you could really do is these high-score type games. And because of this, they had to make each game its own separate system because of how little a Game & Watch system was actually able to show on the screen, which led to a ton of individual systems being produced. But I will say, for being the most simple, brain-dead, see how long you can do this type games, these are somehow able to be super creative. Also, what's really interesting about these things is that they never shut off. That's where the watch part comes into play. They just work as a clock, that's about it. For nearly every major NES or arcade release, a Game & Watch would release to coincide with it, and they would usually resemble something from the game. In 1983 came the release of the Mario Bros. Multi-screen game made to coincide with the Mario Bros. Arcade game. What's funny about this game is that it actually predates the arcade game by a few months, meaning that technically this is the first ever Mario game. This game is Mario and Luigi being plumbers. Wait, no, they work at a bottling plant. Mario and Luigi work at a bottling plant where they must balance their bottle making skills and get it to the delivery truck on time. Is now a good time to say that I don't know what the hell a bottling plant is? Am I stupid? Am I supposed to know this? This game doesn't resemble the original Mario Bros. Arcade game whatsoever, but I think that's fine. Also, where the hell would you even start by making this into a game akin to a calculator? Have you ever wondered why there's no game called Donkey Kong 2? It switches from Donkey Kong to Donkey Kong Jr. to Donkey Kong 3. Well, there is a Donkey Kong 2, in form of a Game & Watch. There's also a Game & Watch for Donkey Kong Jr., and Donkey Kong 3, but it's kind of weird that the only Donkey Kong 2 is in form of this thing. The game has Mario kidnapping Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong Jr. must save his father, so it's Donkey Kong Jr. The gameplay is actually somewhat faithful to the original Donkey Kong Jr., using the multi-screen capabilities of the two-screen Game & Watch systems, which would later be taken inspiration for the Nintendo DS. Although, of course, the gameplay is still Game & Watchified, so, you know, a little boring. Game & Watches are some of the most charming things Nintendo has ever done, and even though none of these are great gameplay-wise, again, they have the power of a calculator, but I mean, just look at these. They're fun. They've even released a few recently with the Mario and Zelda 35th Anniversary Game & Watches. I bought the Mario one around when it came out, and even though this thing doesn't have much in terms of anything, it's just Mario 1 and 2 with the original Game & Watch Ball game. Game & Watch Ball being the first ever Game & Watch release. How fun. Oh yeah, how could I forget the built-in clock for the console? Now it's worth $50. Even though Game & Watches were successful and fun, there's no way that these could be Nintendo's fundamental handheld gaming consoles for the rest of time, especially with much more advanced handheld gaming consoles coming out in the later years of the Game & Watch line, like the Epoch Game Pocket Computer. Yeah, this had Nintendo pissing their pants. But in 1989, Nintendo released their first true handheld gaming system, the Game Boy. You guys are not beating the calculator allegations. The Nintendo Game Boy, while not being the first ever true handheld console, that I believe goes to the Mitten Bradley Company's Microvision, but I wouldn't be caught dead using this thing, so I count the Nintendo Game Boy as being the first ever true success in the handheld industry. The Nintendo Game Boy released in 1989 to monumental success. It used the NES's games as a stepping stone to get off the ground. The NES saw success because the games were actually able to tell stories, somewhat. It was able to tell much bigger stories compared to the 3 pixels on the screen that consoles like the Atari 2600 could produce. The Game Boy used the pre-existing ideas and series introduced on the NES to make its own original games, which essentially just made this thing like a portable NES, just with smaller games, also without color. I'll get to that. Opening up the Game Boy, you're introduced to the console on this ass-puke green display. The Game Boy is made specifically to be sold at a low cost and be very durable, which heavily contributed to its success, but of all colors, did it need to be green? Like the Virtual Boy had to do this exact same thing and they chose red? Still sucks, but at least it's appealing compared to the puke green on the Game Boy. I guess it makes the most sense to use, but it looks so gross, as well as the screen having absolutely no backlight, meaning you can't see anything. I spent $70 on this thing and I can't even see the damn screen. Of course I'm being hyperbolic, the Game Boy screen is often made out to be the worst thing ever, and it's not the worst thing ever. Hitler exists. It's not good, it can't produce color, you can't see it in the dark, and the screen is a radioactive piss color, but it's more than usable. Just be ready to be inconvenienced. There's a contrast dial on the side that allows it to be easier to view in different lighting conditions, which is nice, but the most use I've ever gotten out of this thing is just making the screen all black when I get bored. To not just make the system more viewable, but rather viewable in the dark, you could buy an accessory called the Worm Light. It attaches to this port on the side, and finally, I can play Mortal Kombat 2 on the Game Boy in the dark. Maybe it's for the best, I don't see anything. The general look of the Game Boy is a gray brick with some text on it that says Nintendo Game Boy. What else would it say? Have you ever wondered why they call it the Game Boy? Like, it's iconic, but the last time I checked, these don't have genders. So unless I'm mistaken, we have a case of sexism here? Why is it the Game Boy? Why can't it be called the Game Girl? The Game Boy also includes a small game called Tetris with the system, and this may be the greatest pack-in game to ever exist. You know, Tetris, a simple puzzle game where you gotta stack blocks together to create full lines. Anyone can understand this game, and you can play it on anything. Anything, which isn't always for the best. Well, the first ever true release of Tetris was it being packaged with the Game Boy, and this game works perfectly as a portable game where you can play it on something like the Game Boy. There's no levels to get through, it's just a puzzle game where you can play until you lose. The perfect game to play for a few minutes and then turn it off. Originally, the game Super Mario Land is going to be packaged with the system, however later on they decided on Tetris because it wouldn't just make the Game Boy appeal to kids, but everyone. Yeah, keep telling yourself that. Speaking of Super Mario Land, this game is another reason why I believe the Game Boy was so successful. Mario was huge on the NES, and not just the NES, but the world, so having a Mario game as a launch title for an already super appealing system was beyond novel. The game itself is weird, not really being a traditional Mario game, but rather being a jack of all traits, and succeeding at none of them. The game is incredibly short, only having 12 levels, and besides Mario, there aren't really any recognizable characters in this game. Instead of taking place in the Mushroom Kingdom, this game takes place in Sarasa Land, the home of Daisy, the princess of the land. And rather than having Koopa shells you can jump on to kill other enemies, they explode. Okay. The game's physics are also kind of whacked out. Mario's jump is incredibly floaty, and when he falls super quickly, like it's impossible to react to anything. While the game is definitely flawed in many aspects, I have a lot of respect for this game because you can tell the developers just want to have some fun and implement some weird ideas and features they had. But the sequel to this game, Mario Land and the 6 Golden Coins, expands on this greatly. This game takes place right after the first Mario Land, where Mario goes to his private island for a vacation because we all know that Mario's private island plays greatly into the lore. However, Wario, a longtime rival of Mario, casts a spell on Mario's castle because we all know that Mario owns a castle, and that causes whatever the hell's going on in this game to happen. This game feels much closer to a traditional Mario game while still having the creative level design and ideas from the original Mario Land. And also the controls, while still being a little funky, are much better than the original Mario Land's controls. A simple way of giving you the idea of the general feel of this game is that if the original Mario Land was Mario 1, the main idea was there but it just hasn't stuck the landing completely yet, and then the sequel Mario Land 2 is Mario World where the idea and gameplay is fully, good. For the third Mario Land game, they flipped this idea on its head, rather making the start of the Wario Land series the first ever series to star Wario. Yes, there's multiple. Super Mario Land 3 Wario Land is a game starring Wario where it has some of his own mechanics like bashing into blocks with his elbow. Damn, that must hurt. This game's kind of in a similar situation to the Yoshi series, where Yoshi's Island's full title is Super Mario Land 2 Yoshi's Island. Since both Yoshi and Wario have turned to their own franchise outside of the Mario series, it's hard to know what to classify them as. Do we count them as part of their own series or part of the Mario series, considering the titles? But we aren't here to develop a midlife crisis at the age of 14 whether Wario World is a Wario game or a Mario game. We gotta develop a midlife crisis at the age of 14 by talking about the Game Boy some more. Some other launch titles that released to pick up alongside your Game Boy were baseball. This was during the time when Nintendo developed their own sports games, and this game is, well, it sure is baseball. I've never really cared for these kinds of games, so I don't have the power to create an actual game with actual mechanics, so the majority of this game just consists of pressing the A button at the right time, and baseball on the Game Boy is just that. It's pretty much the same game as the baseball game also created by Nintendo for the NES, except this game is Game Boyified. By that, you need to rely on every sense but your eyesight to play this game. I just don't care for this game. Don't care for it so much that I own a second baseball game for the Game Boy. They are pretty much the exact same game. Baseball on the Game Boy sucks, don't play it. And don't own 2 separate baseball games either. I am insane. Another launch title we got on the Game Boy is Alleyway. It's Breakout. It's just a Breakout ripoff. However, I will say that this game and Tetris are the perfect types of games you can get for the Game Boy. Simple arcadey, get the high score type of games. So this is a more than welcome game for the lineup of Game Boy launch titles. Some other Game Boy games that I really enjoy is Donkey Kong. No, not Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong. No, Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy starts out like the original Donkey Kong, but once you beat the first level, you're introduced to the rest of the game. The rest of this game takes elements from other Donkey Kong and Mario games to create the best way of playing the original Donkey Kong, and that's saying a lot considering that I can't even see the screen. You can do things like throw the barrels back at Donkey Kong, and the game switches up the gameplay so often it doesn't feel like you're just playing basic Donkey Kong, but rather Donkey Kong with more stuff to do. Saying that out loud makes it sound a lot less cool, but what are you gonna do about it? But what other Donkey Kong games are on the Game Boy? Well, we got the Donkey Kong Land series, which you might be inclined to think that this is a sub-series of the main Donkey Kong Country games like the Mario Land series. Well, no. These games are instead meant to be downscaled remakes of the original Donkey Kong games on the Super Nintendo. Now, this may seem like a fine idea, like the Game Boy Color has a remake of the original Mario on the NES. Well, the Donkey Kong Land series is on the original Game Boy, and the only colors this guy can even think of producing are piss green and gray, and I don't know if you've ever looked at how the original Donkey Kong Country games looked, and then looked at how any Game Boy game looked. The old Donkey Kong Country games used a technique where they traced over 3D renders with pixel art to allow it to run on a Super Nintendo, and they tried doing the exact same thing but for the Game Boy. It didn't work. I guess it technically does work, but the Game Boy screen is too small and green to actually make out anything. The screen works much better with small sprites, not super detailed Donkey Kong sprites, so while you can technically play this game, just play the Super Nintendo release, it's way more readily available anyway. Later in the Game Boy's life, actual competition appeared, which from first look should have easily overtaken the Game Boy in a heartbeat, but when you look at it more closely, it's easy to see why the Game Boy is the #1 handheld console to buy for so long. You got the Sega Game Gear, which had a screen that could actually display color and a backlight so you could see, so the bare minimum. Or the Atari Lynx, which had both of these things as well as being able to produce 16-bit graphics, so why was the Game Boy so unaffected by these consoles? So while these consoles are much more appealing to the average consumer in concept, in the 90s having a handheld capable of running bigger and more in-depth games on a screen that you could actually see was actually very cost-effective, and the batteries did not last. These consoles' battery lives stunk. While the Game Boy is able to last 12 hours of interrupted game time on a single set of batteries, consoles like the Sega Game Gear could only last 35 hours on a single set of batteries because of how much more horsepower it took, and the console had a tendency to use its battery life somewhat well off. As well as the Sega Game Gear running on 6 AA batteries compared to the Game Boy's 4. Why would I buy this thing? And the Game Boy having much more appealing games compared to both the Atari Lynx and Sega Game Gear. The Game Gear may have had a million Sonic games, none of which were good, but I want you to name one other notable game on the handheld. Exactly. In fact, I want you to name one. Just one Atari Lynx game. Doesn't need to be notable, just a game. See, exactly, there are none. The Game Boy had multiple Mario games, Donkey Kong games, Zelda games, and tons of arcade games on it. Any consumer would want to pick up this thing compared to the thing with Sonic Blast. And it's not even like the Game Boy wasn't able to play any big games. This thing had some huge games on it, even higher quality than something on the NES, which isn't a huge record to beat, but, you know. And I think no other game cement this more than the Zelda games on the Game Boy, specifically The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. This is truly a great game. Not just a great Game Boy game, but a great game in general, and this was proven with the Nintendo Switch remake of the game in 2019. This game takes place on the island of Koholint, where Link is awakened by a girl named Marin. Hey, that's the name of the game. After Link's awakening, Link goes on a quest to collect the island's 8 instruments and sirens to awaken Koholint's legendary windfish and escape the island. This game has the gameplay of the rest of the top-down Zelda games with dungeons, bosses, combat, and more, and it feels just as good as those console games. No liberties were taken with the downgrade in platforms. The only real downgrade is with the item system in the game, where you have to go through all these menus due to the lack of buttons on the Game Boy. If you can even call it a problem, it's more of a slight annoyance. And this game ends with Link learning that the entire journey he just went on was a dream, and explains some of the weirder elements of the game like the chain chomps from Mario and whatnot. This game is able to tell a full story, bigger than the NES games and even arguably bigger than A Link to the Past on the SNES. This goes to show how Nintendo is more than okay with making full games on the handheld, not just silly little spin-off games, because who cares it's a handheld? It's just a dinky little device to play on the way to grandma's funeral. The Game Boy, it puts the fun in funeral. The Game Boy even had the introduction of the Kirby series with Kirby's Dream Land, which was so successful that they made Kirby one of the biggest franchises by giving him the same support as Mario. While Nintendo supported the Game Boy very well, many third parties just viewed it as another console to dump their games onto, so they'd put out these awful versions of pre-existing games onto the platform. Like, I thought Donkey Kong Land was bad. This is a gift from God compared to Mortal Kombat 2 on the Game Boy. It sucks. In terms of other fighting games, we have Killer Instinct for the Game Boy, developed by Rare. Killer Instinct started in the arcades, just like many other fighting games do, but it also received some home console ports, and that includes the damn Game Boy. This is awful. What were they thinking? I would say that this works much better than Mortal Kombat 2 on the Game Boy as a fighting game. It has more polish and is easier to land moves, but my god, you cannot get a fighting game to work correctly on a console that looks like this. On top of many bad arcade game downgrades on the Game Boy, we also got a ton of licensed games. Licensed games get a bad rep. Most are immediately discarded because they're just made to advertise for a pre-existing property. I never said it wasn't deserved. A ton of absolute shit was spit out for the Game Boy because it's a popular platform, so if they put a popular pre-existing IP on it, it'll have to do well, which I guess it did, so props to them. So while Nintendo's output for the Game Boy was exceptional, a lot of garbage was also put on here. Anyone up for some Addams Family Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt? Please? However, that isn't to discredit many of the great games on the Game Boy. I've already listed off some of my personal favorites or one that I just find neat. But the Game Boy also gave life to the Pokemon series, which is literally the biggest franchise in the world. Late in the Game Boy's life came the release of both Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue, which worked as a dual release for the first Pokemon game. It's impossible to overstate how big the Pokemon series was at this time. With the release of the games, the card series, and the anime, every kid wanted to be a part of this craze. And this started a phenomenon where the media was saying that Pokemon was demonic and indoctrinating kids into worshipping the devil. Okay. Well, obviously no, a silly little series about catching small superpowered animals into magic balls to fight other like-minded people isn't demonic, although now that I say it out loud. All that just goes to show how popular Pokemon truly was. It was banned in schools all over the world because someone thought that Pikachu was actually Satan this whole time. And all of this started with the Game Boy. Say you don't like how the Game Boy looks, it isn't exactly a looker, and that's coming from me. I look like this. Throughout the Game Boy's life, they released the Play It Loud line of Game Boys where you can get a Game Boy that isn't this ass gray. These Game Boys are so much more appealing in design and look a lot less, like a bomb compared to the base gray design. I have no idea why for the marketing this is the main Game Boy they would show. The gray just isn't a fun color, but like red and green, yeah sure. I think that this is to emphasize how the Game Boy is like a mini NES that you can put in your pocket, because comparing these two side by side, they do hold some similarities design-wise. The Game Boy cartridges look like mini NES cartridges, and the controller shares all the same buttons along with the general color, so yeah, I think they were going for that idea. And with many of the games being very similar or outright downgraded versions of games present on the NES, it's obvious why they decided to market it this way. But come on man, the green one is called Gorgeous Green. How could you not show this one in the marketing? There were also some other models made for the Game Boy, such as the Game Boy Pocket. This was made to be a slightly smaller, more ergonomic version of the Game Boy, which looked a lot more sleek, which is why the Play It Loud Game Boys were built off of these. I quite like how the Pocket looks, however I can't give a definitive answer on if it's more comfortable than the original Game Boy because I'm stuck with Grandpa out here. Although I don't see why they needed to make the Game Boy more comfortable. Even the Sega Game Gear is advertised as being the more comfortable handheld, which to me, I don't know, the Game Boy feels fine, who cares? Maybe in terms of fixing things on the Game Boy, they should focus more on the fact that I can't see the damn screen. Oh well, this fixes things. The Game Boy Light released in 1998 and included a backlight on the system so you could actually see your damn games. However, this console was only released in Japan and was only released mere months before the Game Boy Color, meaning, as a member of the home of the obese gun nut, this thing is worthless to me. I love America. Yeah, this thing was released only months before the Game Boy Color, a new handheld which actually had color, only if they included a backlight. Yeah, they decided not to include a backlight just like the original Game Boy, after a Game Boy with a built-in backlight was released. I don't get you guys. I've always viewed the Game Boy Color as less of an upgrade to the original Game Boy, rather being more of a successor with the amount of original games on this thing. It's enough to count as its own original console generation in my opinion, so maybe one day we can have a discussion about this console, but not today. But Nintendo didn't count this as a new system, as for years after the Game Boy Color came out, the original Game Boy would still receive new games. The original Game Boy wasn't fully discontinued until 2003, years after the release of the Game Boy Advance. But even after Nintendo started supporting the original Game Boy less and less soon after the release of the Game Boy Color, the legacy of this console lived on for years. Its next two successors were direct sequels to the Game Boy, being the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, and they even tried to break out to make a new Boy console with the Virtual Boy. It didn't work out. They only stopped using the Game Boy name in 2006 with the release of the Nintendo DS, which just goes to show how successful this line of handhelds truly was. So yeah, that was me taking a look back at the Game Boy, one of the first ever true successes in the handheld industry. Without the Game Boy, we wouldn't have gotten consoles like the DS, Nintendo Switch, or really anything else. I would even say that without the Game Boy, we wouldn't have gotten things like the invention of the smartphone. I'm not gonna back that claim up, so just take my word for it. Oh hey guys, didn't see you there. Very neglectful for the fact that I'm driving a car, but I'm too busy playing Mortal Kombat 2 on my Game Boy. Yeah, I was bitching about this game just a few minutes ago, what about it? But trust me guys, I'm a great driver. I almost passed my driving test. Almost. So just let me have some fun on the freeway, okay?
I blame Nintendo.